Thank you for your recent purchase from Halo Lifts. Today we're going to demonstrate how to install one of our standard size 4-post lifts. This is model number Hl9K-St. As you can see, we have it already sitting on casters. This is just going to make it easier for you to maneuver the ramps into position once you have the cross beams inside the 4 posts and they're propped up. We're going to start by unboxing and showing you everything that's inside. This box has all your hardware that you're going to need. So we'll just put this to the side. Make sure you have everything allocated. So this box includes your motor. You can install it in the front right or back left. So we'll just put this one in the back left since that's how we're going to install it today. These are your cross beams. You'll see one side has the bolts undone. This is going to be on the side of the motor. So since we're mounting the motor in the back left, we're going to have these facing the left side. It's important to see that once you have these posts set up, these locking slots need to be facing up since the cross beam is going to slide in. So always make sure that when you put them down, these locking slots are facing up. As you can see, we have all the posts laid out. One important thing to always keep in mind of is that these locking slots need to be facing up on all the slides. This is because the cross beam slides in, you hold the brake and they'll slide all the way down to whatever position you want to leave it at. These caps come with 2 bolts already on. Make sure that you leave those to the side. You are going to use those when you're installing them. The rest of the bolts that you need are going to be inside your hardware box. If you don't have any rubber posts, we just put the caps on, put underneath, help it lift it. Some of these sliding plates, sometimes they just need to be hammered so they're flush and they slide really smooth down the post. When sliding it in, you just got to hold the brake, release the brake so they slide in. Once you have the cross beam inside the post, hold the locking block disengaged. That way when you both are pulling it down, they slide smoothly. Usually we have on the 8th slot, we just make it a habit, 7 exposed locking slots locking on the 8th. When installing the caps, each bolt has a washer, a locking nut, and a bolt. Make sure you put the bolt from the inside out. Washer, locking nut, bolt. Usually we just put the 2 that came with it, put them on in spot, and then we finish off the rest of the bolts at the same time. Since we're mounting the engine on the back left, this is your mounting bracket. So that's how we know back left. Again, locking slots are facing up. Now that we have the posts up, these casters come in handy. We're going to maneuver the runways into position. This one, as you can see, has a lip, always making sure that the lip faces the inside of the lift on both sides, so both lips face each other. This is going to have your piston inside, so this is going to be switched over and is going to go on our left side. So on the bottom runway, you're going to have your brake lines, your brake hoses. You're going to have your stoppers for both sides. This is going to be fixed on the back side of the lift. As you can see, this one's squared off. The other one has slots. This is meant to be removable. On the front side of your lift, this just goes on after you load a car. These are your mounting brackets for where you put the ramps. This is going to go on the front side of the lift, whichever side you choose. You can just eyeball the location of the runway. You have several holes on the cross beam. The 2 matching holes up here is where you're going to mount your runway. If you're loading the lift from the front, you're going to have the longer bolts, as I'll walk you through. These right here are just for the extension of your brake line, which we'll walk you through as well. Inside this box, you're going to have your casters, 4 casters. These are your push pins to hold your casters in place, locking bolts. This is where all your hardware is going to sit. It's important to know that there's 2 different sizes. Your longer bolt is going to sit on the loading side because you have the mounting bracket. Your shorter bolts are going to be on the back side where the fixed stopping plate is going to go. So for this one, our front is going to be our right side. This is going to be for our locking, our mounting brackets. The rest of these bolts will walk you through after we finish installing. This is your valve that you're going to use to mount the hose for your motor. So we'll put this to the side. Since we're mounting the motor on the back left, you'll also notice that there's a hole on this runway. This hole is always going to match up to the side where you're mounting your motor. This is where this valve is going to be mounted, and we just always keep that in mind. This runway is about 700 pounds. If you have 3 to 4 guys, you might be able to do it on your own, but we're going to be using this shop crane. This is very accessible for most guys. A lot of guys already have it in their shop. So we're just going to utilize this to make it a little bit easier to lift up the runway into position on top of the cross beams. We're using a tow strap with a carabiner. One important thing to notate is that all these bolts that are holding the runways, your forward posts, they're disposable. So you don't need to keep them. Usually we just leave them to the side, but they don't play a role in the installation. So you can chuck them if you want. So as he's lifting the runway, I like to grab the bolt, get it ready. We're gonna use 2 bolts. Make sure you have a washer on the inside and the outside, but it just makes it a lot easier for you to have these bolts ready to go. As your partner's lifting up the runway, you can have these ready to line up. So when you set it down, it's less movement. So now that we have the runway lifted up, it's easier just to maneuver it, get it in place as close as possible as you can. That way, again, you have less to struggle with. So before we release the tension, as you can see in here, these are your 2 holes that you're gonna line up your runway. As long as there's a little tension on the shop crane, you'll be able to dial these bolts in pretty easily. So this is your loading side. These are your ramp side. So always put the bolts from the inside out. Now that we have the runway in position, so you can see you can slide this bolt in pretty easily. These mount this way, and this is where your ramp sits. Again, each bolt, you make sure you have a washer and a tightening nut on each side. It's usually easier since the holding cage is still on. We usually just tip it over, get it into position for the next side. Again, you can see both lips are facing inwards. This is your where your piston is. This is your opposite ramp. So we'll get these bolts ready, as we did on the other side, get the washer in there. These locking nuts will actually help a lot. That way you don't have to hold this side of the bolt. We go back up and finish installing the caps. There's several sizes of bolts. These smaller in comparison, these are gonna be for your casters. We'll walk you through this later. These are the rest of the bolts for your caps. Again, always putting the bolt from the inside out. When tightening these up, you'll notice that if you over tighten, you'll see the top of the post kind of bend in towards each other. So it doesn't have to be too tight. Just hear it until you hear the locking nut engage. This is the runway with the piston. Underneath, you're gonna see these zip ties. Just cut these loose. So these you can take off the bolts. This is gonna make it easier for you to feed these cables through the slots back up to your post. We're gonna do this with all 4. On the cylinder, there's usually a red cap that sits right there. That's easy, you can just hand unscrew it. This will help you pull the cylinder out, release the pressure. That way you can pull your lines and feed them back up to your post. But this one, we already took it off. Usually it's red. You can, like I said, you can unscrew it by hand. Here, we just push it manually, release some tension, and then you'll be able to feed the cables. On this one right here, you see? So this is your left post. They feed through here. We're gonna feed this cable through this slot right here. You can just, pull right easy. Same thing with this side. Feed it through the gap. This can go to the opposite runway. So we feed it through all the way and pull. We're gonna do this with all 4 of the cables, feeding it through the slot. When pulling the cables, it's important that when putting these locking bolts on, they're all the same size of exposed thread. Usually you can gauge it with your finger, or you can count the threads if you want, but it'll make it stable at the end. That way all 4 posts are gonna be at the same height, and the cables are gonna be at the same distance as well. Washer sits on top. Both of these locking bolts will sit on the top. I like to just gauge it using my finger on all 4, but you can use a ruler, or you can count the threads if you want. Now I can demonstrate how we assemble the brake line. This is your main center brake line. We're gonna feed this through. There's a bracket that sits right in the middle of the runway. Feed this through. This is your hydraulic line for the motor, and we're mounting it on the back left. So we're gonna have the handle mounted on the back left of the runway. These have a bolt right here. You can just take this off. We'll reinstall it once we feed it underneath the runway. So you can see this one right here. This has a bracket also underneath that you can feed this through. We're gonna reattach this bolt inside. This is just gonna hold it together once we tighten it all up. This one, you can just push it as far back as possible. This is your connecting line as well. This is gonna go on the opposite side of your handle. You're gonna feed it through the hole that's on the cross beam. Now that we have the 3 pieces together, usually what I do is just make sure that this line is tight. This one you can gauge, just make sure they're spread out equally. It's just equidistant on both sides. I'm gonna tighten this up. This is just manually. We're gonna come back with a 3/4 wrench later. Same thing underneath on this side. Make sure these are loose. You don't want these bolts to be tight. That way when they're tightening the brake, there's not gonna be any issues with the release. Before tightening your brake line, we like to take these off. You're gonna wanna tighten this brake line just enough so that there's not that much wiggle room. So here we still have about 1 inch, so we'll just keep tightening it. Once you see there's not much play in it, that's perfect right there. One thing that we found very useful is to shorten this rod as much as possible. That way you have as much leverage when pulling the brake release. So this one we just undo the bolts. Any screwdriver will help you tighten it up. You don't have to over tighten it, just tighten until you see these locking end caps are tight. So right there, it's starting to get a little harder to twist. So we'll just leave it there. This faces bracket. One thing to notate is the direction in which this locking handle sits away. This bracket will always face away from the post. Now that we have this as tight as possible, we bring the screws, the bolts that we originally took off, and just feed it into place. You can do the first couple manually. This one, you can just turn it so it sits perfectly in line with the bolt threads. This you don't want to over tighten, so usually I just grab a wrench. Once it gets some resistance, that's more than enough. Now we'll finish off on the opposite side. It's important that you look at the direction in which this locking bracket sits. It's always going to sit away from the post. That way you have leverage. We're going to do the same thing with this extension as well. We're going to shorten as much as possible. Now that we have the handle and the external brake line installed, we're going to come back and keep in mind we're going to tighten up these center bolts from one side to the other. It's important that you do that. That way there's no tension in the center rod, because then you're going to lose resistance when you're pulling the lever. So these are both loose. You can hand tighten it. These are 3/4. This you want to be as tight as possible. And then as we go, we feed these bolts back in the opposite direction. So this is where our handle sits for the motor. We started on the opposite side, tightening each nut in progression to the next. So these, as you can see, they're loose, making sure that that is very important. Now that we can, on the 3rd bolt, we'll do the same thing and we'll tighten. And that's it for the brake line. This is your hydraulic fluid line. We're gonna attach our adapter.
All right, so we're gonna attach the hydraulic line. So this is the valve that comes in the box. You'll notice that one of them is removable, one side is removable. So you wanna remove that nut. You wanna take the side that is shorter and has a fixed nut, and you're gonna attach it to the cylinder hose that's underneath the ramp. You're gonna make sure that that's tight. We're gonna grab 2 adjustable. So we're gonna grab 2 wrenches and make sure that it's tight, as tight as possible. It's good. Then you're gonna grab this and you're gonna feed it through this hole in the ramp. So you're gonna come from underneath it, feed it in, take the locking nut, adjust that onto it. Now you're gonna have to grab it from the inside on the bottom, and then also tighten this one. And this is just tightening it to the runway so it doesn't move. So you're good there. Now you have the external hose. So there's a 90-degree and a straight edge. The straight line is going to go to this, and the 90-degree will end up going to the motor. So remove the red cap and simply just tighten this up. This is a pressurized line when we put hydraulic oil into it, so you want to make it sure that it's tight or it's going to leak. So again, you're going to have to tighten this, and it's ideal to grab it from the inside so it doesn't twist, and just simply tighten that. Now we're going to mount the motor. There are long screws that come in the box. There are 4 screws, they're long. That's what's gonna hold the motor into this plate. The bolts are gonna go from the outside in. Washer and a locking nut on the inside. We're just gonna tighten these up. Now we're gonna connect the runway to the motor. Take the red cover off. There's a cover right here for this valve. It's a 3/4 nut, so we're gonna just tighten that up. Make sure to not over tighten this because you can strip it. So you just wanna make sure that it's hand tight. Again, it is pressurized, so it will stay in place. You'll notice that the motors come pre-wired with a 110, so you don't need to hardwire anything. We're gonna fill up the motor with AW46 hydraulic fluid. Takes about 2.5 gallons or 10 liters. of AW46. You can use AW32. If you don't have access to AW46, it will work the same.
Let's install the casters. It comes with 4 casters on here. Make sure you put the bolt bottom up. The same thing with all the bolts. It comes with a washer and a locking nut. So we're just gonna do that with all 4 of the casters. And we can just do one. Yeah. Just put the washer, the locking nut. These are your pulley covers. This is simply just as a safety feature. That way nobody gets their hand. These, we hand tighten it. We don't recommend that you tighten it fully, because sometimes these tend to clamp down and hold the brake from engaging and disengaging. So these, all 4, we're just gonna manually tighten the bolts onto each one. For the pulley covers, you're gonna have the shorter bolts. These, we put the locking nut first and then the washer. As I mentioned, we just hand tighten these just to get them into place and hold. You're gonna have 1 bolt and the second right above. So we have locking nut, then the washer. Before we run the motor, let's just go through some of the key takeaways of the install. We have all 4 posts. Keep in mind, your motor's gonna be either mounted on the back left or your front right. Depending on the location that you choose, you're gonna make sure that you have the ramp that has the piston inside of it on the same side as the motor. All 4 of your posts, the locking slots will always be on the outside. So you can see here, locking slots on the outside. Before you run the motor and tighten up the cables, make sure they're all sitting inside the pulleys. That way, once it's pressurized, it's very hard to get these to release, so you can pull it back in and engage them inside the pulleys. These lips, these are used for your drip trays. Sometimes you can put your jack trays on these, but for our design, they usually sit on the ramps. Your locking brakes, your brake lines, we already walked through that. Make sure they're tight. If you have any issues, we're gonna walk through after on how to troubleshoot that. The first time you run the motor, it's gonna take a little bit of time to create pressure inside the piston and then pull all the cables tight. So you'll see it'll take maybe 30 seconds to a minute, depending on how loose we release that piston underneath. But you'll see it in a couple of seconds now. These are start tightening it up. And again, it's important that you have the cables inside the pulleys. That way there's no issues post. Now that the runways are being raised, one thing to keep in mind is you're gonna hear these locking blocks snap into position as they go up. This, you don't have to hold the lever. They automatically pop into position. This is a safety feature, so if it drops, all 4 will engage at the same time. If you happen to hear the locking blocks snapping into position at different times, that just means that you have to go back and re-tighten each of the cables. That's why it's important that all the cables are at the same distance from the top. If your brake line is installed correctly, when you pull this handle, you're gonna see all 4 of these locking blocks disengage. So we'll walk through all 4, make sure that that's happening on all 4 sides. As he pulls the handle, we have this is disengaged, this locking block is disengaged. So that's a telltale sign. From the motor side, you'll be able to see underneath, all 4 of them are disengaged. At this point, now that you have all the locking blocks disengaged, you can release and lower the lift all the way down. The first time is going to be a little bit slow. We like to run them a couple times up and down. When lowering the lift, it's important that you hold the brake. This is the only way it's going to go down. You have to have the blocks disengaged, or else it's just going to get stuck in the next locking slot. So hold the brake line, handle down, and release at the same time. Before runways are dropped completely to the bottom, this is when you want to put your casters on if you do want to move it. These casters just slide into place as you see here. You have your locking pin, which goes from the outside. You can raise it. You have your washer and your locking pin. These sides have the stoppers. Again, they just slide on the outside of the post. You're gonna lift it up. You just put your washer and your locking pin and you're ready to go. Now that all 4 casters are on, so you can see this is not sitting on the locking slot. So you can just push the brake to drop, hold the brake handle down and the release valve. Sometimes you may need to guide the casters so that way it sits on the outsides of the post, but usually they line up on their own. As the runways start to lower, you're gonna see the casters engage. So the weight of the runways is what's gonna lift up all 4 posts at the same time, allowing you to move it very easily. Sometimes just adding a little bit of weight on top, you can see that all 4 now, there's plenty of space. You'll be able to move this freely, put it into position, and then raise it back up to leave it wherever you want to leave it for your garage. One person can do it, but as always, two guys just makes it a lot easier. Once you have it in the location where you want it to sit, all you have to do is run the motor up and these casters will disengage. You can take them off. These are your steel ramps that come with the lift. These will sit inside just like that.